Welcome to the Biltmore Church Podcast. Our church exists to glorify God by making disciples of Jesus who reach up, reach in, and reach out. And this podcast is a resource that's hopefully going to help you do just that. We're in week 3 of our new teaching series called Ask Me Anything, where we're exploring some of the biggest and toughest questions many of us have about following Jesus. And every Sunday in this series, we're going to tackle a big question that you've submitted. The listener, the watcher, someone at our church has submitted these questions, and we're going to be trying to get to them, as many of them as we possibly can. And so this podcast is going to help us get to even more of those questions, and we're going to dive into another one of those today. Quick introductions, though, first. My name is Christian Cooper. I serve on staff here, and I'm here today again with our lead pastor, Bruce Frank. And also for the very first time on the podcast, we've got Patrick Gallimore, who is our Arden discipleship pastor. Pumped you're here today, man.
Glad to be here, man.
It's going to be a good time. So we're going to jump into today's question. But before we do that, Pastor, you did a great job last weekend of covering the big question here is God a cosmic killjoy? It's a great name. Wish I would have come up with it.
It's one of the few titles I actually do come up with.
Yeah. So before we get to our main question, I just want to go back a little bit to last Sunday and that topic. There were so many elements to the sermon, and kind of kick it to both of you guys and see if there was anything that stood out, any big takeaways, recap from last Sunday.
Sure. Well, I mean, for me, it had a personal element because that, as I mentioned at the start, that in many ways was the lie that was being whispered to me before I became a Christ follower. It's like with looking at my 3 brothers and how their life changed, my interpretation of that was they weren't having any fun. So I was trying to convince myself how much fun I was having. And the text of John 8 describes what I was living, but you don't know you're living it at the time until God convicts your heart. And then you look back and you go, man, I was enslaved to sin and going down a bad place. So it had a personal element to me, but the whole idea of that is the cultural, the worship of self and self-autonomy and no rules, no barriers. Anybody tells me what to do, whether it be tradition, the Bible, things like marriage, whatever. If anybody puts any boundaries in me, that's you're curtailing my freedom. And the reality of it is the theologian Bob Dylan said, we all serve somebody.
Yeah. I had a similar experience where my college roommate had come to Christ. He came back the next year, and I was like, who is this weirdo, and what happened to my friend, I thought the same thing. I'm like, he used to be fun, and now he's not. And then over time, God started to stir in my heart in the same way.
And you're still fun.
I'm still, sometimes.
You're still a fun guy.
Some days.
Okay.
Patrick, what about you, man?
I'll probably say my biggest takeaway was that we all serve something. And we're either enslaved to sin or we're free. We're one or the other. Mm-hmm. And ultimately, man, the main goal is that Jesus wants us to be free. And freedom is rooted in Jesus. So that was my main takeaway, man, from all of the message. Mm-hmm.
That's a great way to summarize the whole thing, I'd say.
Well, and for me, it's a reminder, too, as a Christian, you can be free theologically. You can be free, but not living free. Right. And even believers like that, we can always voluntarily go back into bondage. One was like, what are you doing? And so it kind of goes back, and it was a little alarming to look at the stats of what little interaction that professing believers have with what Jesus says is the key, and that is abiding in the Word. It's like, if you abide in the Word, you'll be free. If you don't, you're not going to be free. Mm-hmm. And it's not just lost or saved. It's also, free and not free. It's joyful and miserable. I think it was like Adrian Rogers 25, 30 years ago. He's like, the most miserable person is not the lost person, because they don't even know what it's like to be free. It's the saved person who's tasted of the kindness of God and knows about the freedom in Jesus, but it's not living free. It's like, that's more miserable. Wow. They're more miserable practically than the lost person, because the lost person doesn't even know it. And but the backslidden, so to speak, as Paul says, Corinthians, the carnal Christian, the fleshly Christian, is like, that's actually because they can't enjoy God, right? Because they're rebelling against Him, even as a son or a daughter, but they can't enjoy the world because the Holy Spirit is going to convict them, and that's that discipline. So anyway, those are a bunch of stuff there. John 8 is, I would think, one of the 5 or 6 fundamental passages for a Christian to get familiar with as far as in their sanctification journey.
Yeah, you can tell. It was a challenging, but also encouraging message. I'd say, hey, go back, watch that thing. If you didn't get a chance to be with us on Sunday, and maybe even if you did, it could be a good week to go back and redigest a little bit.
Yeah, and let me one last thing is, the reason we came up with that title is because I think that's rooted in the bigger umbrella picture, really from what he said to Eve. If you look at the first lie that the enemy said to Eve was basically God's a cosmic killjoy. God doesn't have your best interest at heart. God doesn't really want your deep happiness. And it's like God's just holding out on you, which is amazing because he did so in the context of abundance. Right. All this, think about how many trees that she had to walk by to get to the one tree that she was not supposed to touch. Mm-hmm. And we're like, oh, she's so dumb. She's so dumb. We do the exact same thing. And we have this abundance that we have. And yet we're like, I don't want to see that. I don't want to see that. Give me that one thing that's forbidden, that one thing. And so anyway, there's that whole thing that God's holding out on you. That is, to me, that is the lie, even that believers listen to all the time, is like, he's holding out on you. You need a better house. You need a better wife. You need a better whatever. And it's always chasing. And never satisfies. And my buddy Joby Martin is the first guy I heard talk about this. When he moved to Jacksonville, I guess those races, the Greyhound races, where they chase after this mechanical rabbit. Yeah. And he was like, they never, first of all, they never catch the rabbit. They never catch it. It's like, it's always just out of reach. But every once in a while, if the thing breaks down and they somehow get a hold of this rabbit, they're chewing on it going, this is not satisfying at all. I'm like, that's the picture of a believer who's not free. They're chasing after something and they never get it. And if they ever do get it, that job, that whatever, they're like, this is not what
Doesn't satisfy.
Right. That's good. That's good.
Challenging word. Make sure you go back and check that out from last Sunday. We're going to be covering even more in the next few weeks. We'll talk about what this one coming up this Sunday is toward the end of our episode. But today, question for you guys, wanted to kind of throw out into the room and just see where it goes. One that I think many people ask, depending on what season of life they're in, where they're at in their sanctification journey, is some version of this question. Do I really need to go to church to worship God? Do I really need to go to church? The way we phrase it a lot is like, I can worship God while I'm fishing in the river or while I'm on the lake or while I'm hiking or whatever. Why do I need to go to church? Right. So let's just throw it out there, see where it goes.
The way that question is kind of a yes/no answer. Can you worship God out on the lake? Can you worship God in a deer blind? Absolutely, you can. Absolutely, you can. But the taking that question further, though, it's not a either or. It's a both and. Clearly, people is like, well, I love Jesus, but don't love the church. That person is either arrogant or ignorant, because they're either arrogant thinking I can do this whole thing by myself, or they're ignorant because they're like, you cannot read 5 pages in the Bible, particularly in the New Testament, when you don't see the idea that God says part of your journey is going to be with brothers and sisters. Right. They're not perfect. And that's what, and that's why sometimes people are like, I don't want to go to church because it's full of hypocrites. Well, that works in no other area of life. If you see hypocrites at the grocery store, it's not like, well, I'm not going to eat any longer. Or I'm not going to go to the grocery store. No, you're not going to the grocery store because there's some. That's why it's not this museum with a bunch of perfect people. Sometimes what we think of is a hypocrite, and there is hypocrisy for sure. Right. But I think more what you have is you do have people trying and failing. That's not hypocrisy. All right, that's just life. Yeah. Hypocrisy is when you are an actor. It's actually a picture of I'm putting on a mask and I'm not even trying to be a different person. Right. But what you see at church is you've got imperfect people, and we learn from them. I learned from people's mistakes as well as great examples, and I've been a bad example and a good example before. Mm-hmm. So the one thing that sticks out over and over again is when it's like, do I have to go to church? I think number one, it's clear you need it. We can talk about why. It's community. It's community. And the second thing is not just that God says you need it, but people need you as well. I think everybody here and there played some degree at some part of sports, and those ones where it's just you are infinitely more challenging at times, like golf or tennis. But even they have their little team. Right. But the idea is, that's why the Bible talks about the church being like a body. A family. Those are all collective group type dynamics. And so we can talk about how that breaks down, but anyway, do we need to? It's a both and, not a either or is what I would say.
Yeah, that's great.
Yeah, I agree with that, man. Yes, you can worship God anywhere, but at the same time, you don't want to neglect corporate worship with other believers, because that's what we get better. We shape ourselves. It challenges us. And when we decide, hey, I'm going to do this thing by myself, even God said it was not good for man to be alone. And I know we take the context of that. We're talking about a spouse, but at the same time, it's not good for us to be alone. Just like Pastor said in the book of Acts, it talks about community and how they devoted themselves to the apostles' teaching and everything grew. So it's very important to worship. But at the same time, we can't be like, well, hey, I'm just not going to go to church. It doesn't work like that. I'm better because I'm in church. And it's a challenge when you decide, hey, man, I'm just going to do this thing by myself. And we can't do it by ourselves. Life is better in community.
Well, true. And I mean, how many times have we heard over the last years, people have gone from coming out of the pandemic and have started, I mean, I've heard this, I don't know how many times, we were watching online and people got comfortable, in different stages. But how many times did you hear it's like, oh, it's so different being with people versus watching online. So we try to do a great job online, and online is great for if you're traveling, if somebody lives out in the middle of Montana where there's no church within 100 miles of them or whatever that is. But generally speaking, shoulder to shoulder, brothers and sisters, there's some things God, like the book of Psalms, how many times did we see in that 4.5 months? The collective worship, let us worship the Lord. Let us shout together. So there's that collectiveness that is super clear. The designer made us to live in community. Now, you all need that. I go back to it. Can you worship God in the deer blind? I hope so, because I've done it a bunch of times. Prayed a lot in the deer blind for God to send one of his creatures along. But so you can do that, and you definitely have to have private worship. But that collective community sense is absolutely. It's one of the 3 or 4 fundamentals in just being a believer.
Right. I mean, even David says, like in Psalms 34, when he says, I will worship the Lord at all times, and his praise shall continually be on my mouth. And he says, hey, let us worship God together. I mean, it's us. Like, we are better together. I think the danger is when we decide, hey, man, I'm going to do this thing by myself. And it's not designed for us to do life by ourselves. I mean, for me, COVID was just the absolute worst. It was that was not good for me because I like being around people. And when I'm not around people, I feel like I'm not fulfilled. So when we have the opportunity to worship with one another, it allows us to just grow better as believers. It allows us to connect with people. That's why connect groups are so important, why we're trying to get people plugged in, because life is so much better in a group that we don't have to do life alone. Yes, I can worship in my car. Yes, I can have private worship, but there's nothing better when the body of believers get together and we're all focused on the one person, and that person is Jesus.
Yeah. And I would say there's kind of there's 2 levels of this. One of them, when you say worship together, so that's in a sense, that collective sense, whether it be 100 people or 1,000 people or 8,000 people or whatever together. It's that there is a bunch of stuff where God says, I'm going to do some stuff that is supernatural in the midst of the body that he doesn't necessarily do alone. I mean, there's a sense of, all right, the supernatural that goes on. The level below that, though, is what I would just call friendships. Do you have friendships? And you don't necessarily have to have a ton. I mean, you're going to have a different circle. You've got acquaintances and you've got friends, and then you have close friends. But the idea is to at least have some. I mean, and you can never tell when is somebody that's a friend going to become a close friend. Well, the only way that happens is just with time and experiences. Typically, I can just speak for guys. Guys, we usually get closer to the guy when you do something experiential with them.
Yeah, side by side.
Yeah, some kind of activity. Whether it be a sports team. Military talks about it all the time, or even just like a fun trip. You're just like, hey, you go back to those experiences, but you can't. You can't make. You're going to be a close friend of me now. No, that's through conversation, through experience, through trust. But here's the deal: you got to have somebody. I can't remember exactly how it was phrased, but you need somebody that is going to lift you up, because you're going to get discouraged at time. All right, you're going to get down. I had a couple of guys during COVID that like just pouring life into me. During a couple downtimes, you need somebody to just pull you up. That's encouragers. You need somebody to hold you back. Because as we talk about it, we're all one decision away from stupid. And virtually every person you see really flush their life does so usually in isolation.
Yeah.
Now, it doesn't mean that they weren't around people, but there was nobody in there, that could look and, and hey, Patrick, all right, how you liking the mountains?
Right.
All right, how you like this cooler weather? His answer would be, this is so much better than a custom.
It is so much better.
It's at least so much better than 99 and 99% humidity.
Yes. I'm not
At least
sweating
weather-wise.
walking outside to my
You got a
car, so I'm
sweatshirt on. You didn't put that sweatshirt on until February in Augusta. So anyway, we can talk about this forever, but I think we covered the bigger parts.
Yeah, that's great stuff right there. Let me challenge you. If you are you're listening and watching this, and maybe you're attending church, maybe you're not attending church, you heard a lot about community right there, and we want to encourage you to not just to show up and come to a church service and leave anonymously. I mean, that has some benefit to it, but how much more beneficial it is to get involved with community, with those people like you're talking about who are. You're investing in each other. You're helping each other grow, as Patrick mentioned, the one another. So join a group. Question,
Mr. Cooper, how would one go about doing that if they're listening? At least here in the 828, they don't have a church home. Would there be a website?
If only there was.
If only there was.
I would say carrier pigeon would be the best option. But soon after that, Patrick, you know this probably better than I do, but I think biltmorechurch.com/groups.
Yep.
Right?
What will happen if they do that? If they'll go on there and they're like, hey, I'm interested, what will happen? A pastor will contact them or try to help them find one, right?
In fact, there is a list of all of our groups. It's just
This
so
is
fun.
such a softball.
It's just like lob it up.
70 mile an
What's
hour
gonna
right
happen?
down the middle.
Hypothetically.
Just land the plane.
So Group Finder, you see all our groups. Either a pastor or even sometimes a group leader of that group will reach out and help get you connected. So make sure you do that soon. You need that in your life. You passed. So, there we go. I didn't know if there was going to be any more follow-up softballs there. Thanks so much for listening and being on this journey with us this week. We hope it encourages you in your faith. As always, you are loved and sent.